running a business is a tough and lonely journey. Welcome to the Executives on the Front Lines podcast, where business owners and C-suite executives like you will get real answers to your everyday business problems. I'm your host, Jeff Palacio, and together we will learn from senior leaders who have occupied every top box of a company's org chart for every size organization and who like to roll up their sleeves while checking their egos at the door. Welcome to another episode of the Executives on the Frontline podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Palacio, and today we're going to talk about the growing area of greenhouse gas management and its building block role in the broader area of sustainability, disclosure frameworks, and reporting for companies. Our expert guest today is Lance Chastain. Lance, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Jeff. Nice to be here.
Lance, you and I just met, although we're somewhat neighbors. I'm in Lenexa, Kansas, outside of Kansas City, and you're in Wichita, Kansas. So but we met via Zoom, and I just love your story in terms of what you've done career-wise and your servant leadership. You're a founder in multiple industries with exits. Successful CEO. You're a pretty smart guy of 2 patents, but I just love your pivot in what you're doing now in your new company and you're in the whole greenhouse gas emissions space. So why don't you just give a brief summary of that pivot in your career?
In my last company that I was an investor and CEO of, we were a decent sized federal government contractor. We worked on military bases all over the country in digital infrastructure. And as we came to 2019, 2020, I started getting little pieces of information that greenhouse gas emissions reporting might be something that would be required of us as a federal contractor. And of course, there were other activities in this area going on, of course, in Europe. And what I really wanted to learn about was, okay, if this is going to be something that we're going to have to deal with, I need to have an understanding of it. And to be candid, I had a little bit of a bias. I wasn't quite sure, what it involved. I wasn't quite sure if it was, science-based or what exactly am I going to be dealing with, ranging from a continuum of capitalism to maybe, climate activism or something of that nature. Molecules in the atmosphere are neither red nor blue, as I had indicated to you, I think, in a previous discussion. They just behave in a certain way. And what that translates into is consideration for how do we think about greenhouse gas emissions and reporting of those from a science and business standpoint.
Thanks for that summary, Lance. I'd love your lifelong learning to go back to, basically Colorado State graduate degree and then Colorado School of Mines and then your certification in the greenhouse gas emission. So what, in terms of your conversations you're having with C-level leaders and their teams in greenhouse gas emissions and all that, what are they talking about? What are some of the considerations?
I think it ranges from none to what I would characterize, Jeff, as very forward thinking. And to contextualize that a little bit more, if you're a small company operating in a certain city or geography, and you're not dealing with a complex supply chain or for example, you're not a supplier to an Amazon or a Walmart, you're likely not going to be considering anything in this area at this point. You're focused on making money and driving your business and doing a good job for your customers. If you are, however, a smaller size company or you have a more complex supply chain or even a larger company, you're probably hearing about it or thinking about it. And what we see are really those individuals or those companies as leaders in the space. Now, some of them are not regulatory focused. They're more thinking about their market reputation. They're thinking more about their customers or their suppliers. Or, for example, in the case of Walmart and their Project Gigaton or Amazon and their reporting efforts, and then working with companies or organizations like CDP, where companies are being asked to report their sustainability initiatives in their framework, uh, you're you're likely, regardless of your size, you're likely on the front edge of this, and would be what we think of and what we see as leaders in the space, notwithstanding whether or not regulatory or compliance issues are upon you. Why do we call them leaders? Well, because while as companies and leaders or leadership teams, they're not required to report under any framework. Like, for example, the SEC, we've seen some things about that recently, and there's going to be a lot more around that as we go forward. These companies have taken a proactive posture and are gearing themselves, their companies, with the right people, systems, software, and mindset to get in front of that. And that may impact our governance in the future. We also see these companies having what we would call a listening ear towards the market, investors, stakeholders, customers, and even board members who are asking questions about their sustainability initiatives and how they're quantifying that. And one last thing I would say is that we are actually seeing fewer and fewer companies of any size who aren't at least considering it now and looking into solutions. The biggest decisions these companies are making beyond the commitment to report and what that actually means for them and their organizations is how do we go about implementing it for our company? There's a myriad of options and tools and resources available. What people do they need? What software makes sense? What is it going to cost? How do we scale into it? And can we scale into it? Are some of the questions that we hear more about.
Lance, is there anything specific to the lower and mid-market companies out there in terms of their pain points that they're dealing with when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions reporting?
Less and less we hear about whether or not a company needs to do it or wants to do it. Of course, that's still present, but with more and more companies and their supply chains or their value chains being impacted, as I mentioned earlier, about the related requests for information or reporting, of course, think about Amazon or Walmart and others. It's becoming much more common. And I think that from our standpoint, what we hear a lot are there's 4 or 5 important considerations for lower middle market. The first one I would say is more general. It's around having a point of view. It's what I call having a point of view. How do we think about greenhouse gas emissions? How do we think about sustainability? Why are we doing it? What is our framework for decision making in the area? If it's not required, for example, why are we doing it? And I think that's a really important point for companies and leadership teams to debate and talk about and figure out what they want to do. What can inform that point of view are questions to board members, to stakeholders, even from financial institutions and from other regulatory agencies. Are there reasons to be thinking about it for lower middle market companies? Absolutely. A more concrete one is the cost. It's definitely a pain point. The question around what is it going to cost us? Do we have a budget for it? We have conversations with companies all the time that look at the budget they allocated for this particular area in their software or their team. And now they're looking at it and saying, we need to increase this budget. And then that becomes a question of, okay, we're going to spend more money. What are we going to get for it? Excellent question. And it speaks to our tagline of we make sustainability a competitive advantage. And we can talk more about that later, but we definitely are sensitive to that. The second one is around people, Jeff. Who do we need or who do we have in-house that can be utilized for this purpose? We see companies that, select options like taking their accounting or finance group and putting somebody in charge of it, which was interesting because some of this is likely to end up in that area anyway. Or maybe they take operations, look at it there, or possibly compliance if the company's that large, or even hiring an outside firm. The third one is probably a big one also is IT considerations. Depending on the company, that can be important. If it's a lower middle market company and they have a lot of of inputs to their supply chain or a lot of data sources that where their emissions are going to come from, that's going to be a consideration to how to automate all that data collection for the purposes of a software like Nectivio. And lastly, is going to be the ultimate choice of the software and the tools they use. What are exactly the right tools and the right software, and are they scalable? Are they cost effective? Are they robust? Do they give us the visibility and the level of granularity and detail to our emissions profile that we really want?
What do you think are some of the critical risks for companies that are ignoring or delaying their greenhouse gas emissions, data collection, management, and reporting?
If your company has a valuable market leading position, regardless of its size, we're seeing more companies now than ever with a smart, cost efficient leadership mindset in this area. They're focused on getting their reporting and management in order and are beginning to report on key metrics for their stakeholders, even if it's a building process. Maybe they reported on a number of emissions or a certain number of emission sources 2 years ago, and they built on that a little bit last year. Now this year they're reporting on even more. In other words, they're building towards it, and that's a really smart way to walk right around the risks of ignoring. If you ignore it, it's a building process, and there's a lot of learning that goes on inside of companies. And to your point, you just said, it does touch on every aspect of the company. We see that a lot. And so when we're dealing with companies and implementation of our software, we're talking to procurement, we're talking to the supply chain people, we're talking to IT, we're talking to leadership, we're talking to the sustainability. So it's touching on all those areas. So the larger the company, the more complex the conversations are and the more involved they are. Another thing I would say is that while our software and implementation process is very straightforward, it can take a while, as I just touched on, for the software to be integrated across all the different departments, including sustainability, operations, IT, compliance, leadership, into a cohesive and developed plan that gives them a company-wide approach. Even if leadership, for example, doesn't see an immediate need for it, today it's likely there will be or already are requests coming from suppliers or customers or stakeholders or financial institutions or insurance companies for the data, and getting in a position to provide that without scrambling or cutting corners is really important. And the last thing I would say on this is that accurate, and I know I'm probably getting a little technical here, but accurate emissions activity data collection is the most time consuming and costly aspect of this for all companies. We have an enterprise client that we're working with that at last count has 9, maybe 10 different emission sources. And every one of those emission sources is in a different system. And what we're going to do with our public API is work with them to connect every one of those emission sources automatically to our platform to eliminate what I'm describing here is this very costly and time consuming and not cost effective at all, a way of manually collecting that data.
So Lance, I think you touched on this in your previous answer, but I know when we met for the first time, you were talking about how companies use spreadsheets that have carbon calculators, but your company's platform is much more robust. So what are some of the key differences that matter to companies in terms of what your platform does versus these spreadsheets?
I think of carbon calculators as what we used in school for calculating our personal emissions footprint for assignments. We'd go online and find one, and they were free, and they did a good job. And but they really are a dime a dozen. And like I said, you can find them free everywhere online. As my co-founder likes to say, the actual calculations of emissions is not complicated, and it's really not. You simply take the activity source data times an emissions factor that is typically available to you in a database or in the software itself. And for that type of emissions data, and then you have a product then that measures the CO2e or CO2 equivalent emissions for that specific activity. However, this doesn't really scale beyond a few calculations or really one person. Even more involved and developed spreadsheet-based products that we've encountered in the market are really lacking for many reasons. One, data loss due to changes in personnel or method of collection. Someone changes the spreadsheet or changes the tabs to their liking and blows out all the formulas. We experienced that in more than one situation and required a rebuild of their data. Manual entry errors, transposition, and mistakes of misreading from the source data. So you're looking at another system over here that's, for example, producing, the number of miles a vehicle was driven or the amount of fuel that was purchased, entering that in and getting the tag wrong on that can result in inaccurate data. The cost of adding personnel to collect, input, and generate reporting. There's really no good way to scale a spreadsheet reporting tool in that regard. Everybody needs a spreadsheet in that situation. Everybody needs a way of calculating, and it's not all going ultimately into the same database of data. Reporting and visualizations are limited without add-on functionality, tools, or expertise. So if you want reports, you can certainly get them there. Certainly there's a lot of powerful capabilities of Excel and other add-ons, but they're not native to the actual spreadsheet calculator itself. There's typically what we see is little to no opportunity to eliminate repetitive tasks. The automation of data collection for scaling purposes. I touched on this a little bit earlier. Say you have a fleet of 100 vehicles on road and off road, and you're using telematics of some kind. We have the ability to connect directly to that telematic source and pull that data into Nectivio, and on some regular cadence, whether it's weekly or monthly or whatever you prefer. And there's literally, other than looking at it, and our system will generate an alert to you if it's not working. Looking at it, make sure that data is being collected and aggregated into our system. There's really no need for any additional work or any additional collection activity at all. If you're a mobile company that has a lot of mobile activity or activity in the field, we have an app that allows you to actually collect data via a screen grab or a photo, bring that in, and our AI will actually interpret that data and drop it into a screen and give you the ability to verify that particular emission source or that particular emissions data before it goes into the system. So we have about 7 different ways to automate the data collection, and it makes our platform incredibly scalable that's not present with spreadsheets. And the last thing I just touched on is the capturing of images and actual source data from the field or from reporting or from documentation. Extremely important in the future as verification and auditing becomes much more important.
Lance, your platforms just sounds so comprehensive and robust. But yeah, no, it's thank you for your time. Your expertise in this space and how you got into it and all your business background. I can imagine how you can help clients. So thank you for coming on the podcast. We'll include the link to a 1-page, 2-page summary that you'll present where people could download for free. So thanks, Lance. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Jeff. You too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Executives on the Front Lines. If you are interested in learning more about today's guest, you can schedule a 15-minute call with them by scanning the QR code or using the link in the episode description. Please join me every 2 weeks to learn from another great leader sharing insight that can help you and your business.